Henry Ford was born on July 30, 1863 in Greenville Township, Michigan to William and Mary Ford. Starting off as a farm boy who fixed watches, he later became one of the most important men of the 19th century. As an engineer for Edison Illuminating Company, he was able to save up enough money to work on his first car, the quadricycle. He called it the quadricycle since it stood on 4 bicycle wheels. Henry was able to get most of the plans for the engine from the November 1895 issue of American Machinist magazine. He later sold the quadricycle for $200 to start working on his next car, and later the creation of Ford Motor Company.
In Detroit, a man named Henry Ford, who had left the farm and come to the city to tinker with machinery, was making what he called a quadricycle. It looked like a buggy, only it had no shafts for a horse to be harnessed to. The horsepower was going to come from a gasoline engine he'd made himself. He did everything himself, working nights and holding down a daytime job with the Detroit Illuminating Company. It took a long while to make this machine, but Henry Ford stuck to it, and finally it was ready. One momentous night, he pushed it out for its first trial run. Up and down the dark, empty streets ran the little quadricycle. Past the sleeping houses, ghost-like and unreal, flitted the shape of things to come. If anybody had waked up and looked out the window, he probably would have thought he was still dreaming. That night, history was made. The street was never the same again.
Henry Ford's most successful car was the Model T. At that time most cars were only affordable by the rich, and he wanted to change that. The Model T was sold for $825, which then dropped to $360 to be more affordable by most people. Along with the Model T came Henry's perfection of the assembly line. He was able to make it so that the Model T went from taking around 12 hours to make, to under 3. By 1918 about half of all cars in America were Model Ts, and by 1927, 15,007,034 Model Ts were sold.
Henry Ford changed the American way of life. Ford's designs changed how we get around, from horse-drawn carriages to automobiles. Henry Ford was an engineer and a businessman. He spent his early career working on steam engines. In 1896, Ford built his first car, the quadricycle, and never looked back. He spent the rest of his career making cars. The Model T became the most famous, a car that changed history. Before it were cars that only the very rich could afford. The first Model T was built in 1908, and with the top speed of 45 miles per hour was a much faster way to travel. It was in 1913 that Ford introduced an idea that revolutionized how cars were made. He used an assembly line, a moving belt that would carry car parts to workers, who put the parts and the car together, piece by piece. With the assembly line, a car that once took 12.5 hours to make, now took less than 6. So the Model T cost less and took less time to assemble, making it a car that many working Americans could afford. By 1927, the Ford Motor Company had made a total of 15 million Model Ts.